The United States of America is the most powerful nation on earth. It is arguably the most powerful nation in history. So, to what purposes should that power be put? What is and should be the right and best role for this country in world affairs?
For hundreds of years in English-speaking courtrooms around the world, people have sworn an oath to tell not only the truth, but rather the whole truth. The oath reflects the wisdom that failing to tell all of a story can be as effective as lying if your goal is to make the facts support your point of view. In the courtroom, the search for truth also relies on advocates advancing firm, contradictory arguments and doing so with decorum. All these apply to the court of public opinion, what John Stuart Mill called the marketplace of ideas. This series is a place in which the competing voices on the most important issues of our times are challenged and set into meaningful context so that viewers like you can decide for themselves the whole truth. George Washington warned the new America against entangling alliances with foreign nations, and John Quincy Adams urged that Americans go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Shortly thereafter, we would, in the Monroe Doctrine, declare geopolitical hegemony over the entire Western Hemisphere, and within 2 decades proclaim the manifest destiny to span from the Atlantic to the Pacific. A half-century later, President Woodrow Wilson began to speak of America as a world power different from all those which came before, and counseled an American responsibility to create a world order safe for democracy and safe from major war. For 70 years following the Second World War, the United States acted as a global colossus, with no corner of the planet too remote to be beyond the reach of American power, and very few events anywhere agreed to be beyond the scope of American interests. And perhaps the culmination of this expansive view of America's role in the world came in the second inaugural address of President George W. Bush, who said, "So it is
the policy of the United States to seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nation and culture with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world."
But President Obama and President Trump, in different ways to be sure, both campaigned for office and governed from a premise that America was overextended and needed to do far less as world policemen. Today on The Whole Truth, we are going to hear from brilliant and passionate advocates of very different schools of thought concerning America's place in the world now and looking towards the future. Here with us are William Ruger, Vice President of Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute, Dr. Barry Posen, the Ford International Professor of Political Science at MIT, William Kristol, Director of Defending Democracy Together, and editor-at-large of The Bulwark, and Michelle Flournoy, co-founder and managing partner of West Exec Advisors and former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Obama administration. From Indispensable Nation, which is where I think we were 20 years ago, to America First. We are, in fact, engaged in a great debate in this country about foreign policy. How did we get there from there to here? I'd like to go around the table. Indispensable Nation to America First.
You know, when you think about any really major problem, whether it's climate change or nuclear proliferation or what have you, very hard for any one nation, even the most powerful nation, to deal with that alone. And so the U.S. was seen as the leader, the indispensable leader to build coalitions of like-minded states to go after either the solving or the management of some of these hard problems.
But isn't that a phrase that begins with Albright, or no?
I think it was, the phrase may have begun with Bill Clinton and Secretary Albright, but the idea behind it, I think, was, shared over a longer period of time. The transition to sort of America First is almost a back to the future idea. It's a more isolationist stance, but I think it's in part a backlash against the sense that at some points America became overextended, particularly in military interventions in Iraq and to a lesser extent maybe Afghanistan. But I think there was this, and also the sense that the United States in leading was also bearing a disproportionate burden vis-a-vis our allies. It's a view that tends to undervalue the strategic importance of those unique alliances and relationships.
Bill, how does it look to you? Quite a change, huh?
Yeah, it's a decline. I mean, because the truth about Indispensable Nation is Madeleine Albright didn't just make it up and sell it. It was a fact. It was a fact in World War II. It was a fact in the Cold War. It was a fact in the Balkans. And it was a fact, in my view, after 9/11, and remains a fact if there's to be any hope of a better Middle East for this century, which I think there remains some hope for, despite various attempts of ours to withdraw from that effort. And it incidentally is also a fact of how dangerous the world becomes if we do just decide to wash our hands of places, as we did Afghanistan, which really is high on the list of places you would want to wash your hands of if you look around strategically, and all the alleged brilliant strategists were all fine with getting out of Afghanistan in '89 and not wasting resources there. It's so many thousands of miles away and so underdeveloped. And how did that work out? So I think America First, unfortunately, is a mixture of wishfulness, some nostalgia, as Michelle says, and actually a lot of just ill spirit towards, a certain kind of selfishness that, why are we wasting this money? We're not spending that much money, but anyway, by historical standards, why are we wasting this money on foreigners? And, we can't, as Trump himself has said, these places have been fighting wars forever, and God forbid that we should actually try to stop them from fighting this time. Right. I heard that in the middle of the Balkans when I was strongly supporting the Clinton administration, actually, in their intervention. Oh, they've been killing each other for centuries. Well, to some degree, yes. Actually, there have often been long stretches where they didn't kill each other, and they're not killing each other now. And that's a lot better, even if they don't love each other, than ethnic cleansing. So I'm very much on the Indispensable Nation side of this debate.
Right. Mr. Ruger.
Well, I think the reason why there's a shift in sentiment towards America's role in the world is frankly because the last 20 to 30 years of American foreign policy hasn't been really going that well for the United States in terms of promoting our safety and the conditions of our prosperity. If you look at some of the debacles over the last 20 years, starting with Iraq to the nation-building project in Afghanistan, it's not been going well, to Libya, which is an underrated mistake. These are cases in which the United States and the American people just don't seem to be seeing a return on that investment. And I think that's one of the reasons why Americans are willing to listen to new ideas and to rethink our foreign policy, to ask what role should the United States play in the future. I don't think Americans want to disengage. Engagement is important, for example, in terms of trade, in terms of diplomacy. But the question is how should we use American military power, again, in the context of those mistakes? And I think that means more prudence when we use force abroad. It means focusing on using power only when it's necessary for our safety, for the conditions of our prosperity, especially because of the costs of those things. There's a human and financial cost, but there's also a cost to our liberal democratic system. And I think that that's underrated as a kind of a problem of American foreign policy, is how our foreign policy actually can create conditions that are destructive of our own society.
Dr. Posen.
It's a complicated odyssey from one kind of high concept, indispensable nation, to a different one, American First. And I think there's many elements to it. I think one of the things that's happened abroad is that the shift in power since the end of the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, the Americans were really the only superpower left in the world, really the only great power at the time. We may still be the only super and global power, but there are great powers out there in 2 or 3 regions of the world, which changes the game. I mean, in many collective problems, it's not just the Americans who are the indispensable nation. All the rich and powerful nations are indispensable for the purposes of solving those problems now. This was simply not the case then, or it was not as much the case then. And then the second matter, I think, is the effect at home. And I do think that the indispensable nation rhetoric encapsulated a larger policy that allowed for the Americans to consider most problems to be theirs and most problems to be soluble by us. It's an odd statistic that we were at war more often in the post-Cold War world than we were during the Cold War, at kinetic war. This is a kind of odd, given how secure we are, and that arises from this notion that we had to solve all these problems. And I think, I don't read the American public very well, but I think it's hard to feed people a steady diet of fear and conflict and war for decades without Americans beginning to scratch their heads and saying, can it really be true that all these problems are ours?
Question of, I would say, resources. Look at World War II figures, a nation of 160 million people. At Operation Victory envisioned 330 combat divisions. We mobilized 90 divisions. That's 10 times the size of the Army we're deploying now. I would say that viewed in relative terms, the American appetite or capacity seems to have diminished somewhat. And how would you account for that?
The people who argue for a different approach to our grand strategy don't rely on the idea that it's too expensive. What they rely on is an argument about what America's interests are, what is the threat environment, what are some of the constraints in the international system, and what means we should choose to meet those ends. And the fact is that we could afford a lot of military power, but we would have to make trade-offs, and we've been making those trade-offs for some time. And I think a lot of Americans are looking around and saying we would be better able to spend that money here at home on a variety of things, whether you're a person on the left who wants to have increased government spending on health care, or a person on the right who wants to see...
Hasn't that always been the argument against overseas involvements?
Right, and it's important because, again, we need to
Always.
make decisions about trade-offs. I mean, there's no free lunch, right? I mean, that's something that, we've learned in our history. We also need to say restraint is desirable, even though it's not necessary from a financial standpoint, because we're almost $23 trillion in debt. The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, said when he was asked, what is our greatest national security threat? And, you think he might have said China or Iran or terrorism. He said our national debt and deficits. And I think we ought to take that seriously because economic power is the foundation ultimately of long-run military power. So if we want to stay healthy in terms of our economy, but also healthy in terms of our ability to be an exceptional nation.
Bill, what does
Look,
that say?
I agree with that. I mean, obviously there are trade-offs and so forth, we should discuss some of the more particular ones. I also think it's not ultimately about a few marginal, even billions of dollars, but rather about what the right foreign policy is for the country. And in that respect, it is more of a debate about the country, its meaning, its role in the world. I mean, the Cold War all in was a time of very high defense spending and the time of the fastest economic growth in American history. So I'm not convinced at all that that one takes from the other. Also a time of, I think we would agree on this, too much growth in the domestic government and, plenty of government spending on health care and, incidentally, considerable progress on civil rights and other civil liberties issues, I would say. So I don't even buy the argument, though I know it's a familiar one, and not without elements of truth, obviously, that, if you're fighting these wars, whether big or small, you create the national security state and then civil liberties get impinged. Not that they couldn't be, but I don't think that's at all inevitable. And I think we've done a pretty good job, actually, since 1919 and then since the Japanese internment in 1940 in World War II, that, in trying to balance much more carefully civil liberties and fighting the war. So I agree. It's very much a question of what you think is good for America, what you think is good for the world, what our obligations are abroad, what the trade-off is of a badly executed war in Iraq. I couldn't agree more with that in the first 3-4 years, and not intervening in Syria. I mean, those are real things that, and in that respect, I welcome the debate. I very much agree that there might have been too much mindlessness at one point in assuming we could just do everything and it would all work out well. And the way in which you do it matters, as Michelle knows extremely well, having been there. The way in which you do it matters a heck of a lot in foreign policy, not just the intention, right?
Bill's put his finger on something that I'd like to raise with the panel, but this is oscillations. The reason you trigger this is you say, what is the correct foreign policy for America, the meaning of our country, meaning. To what degree does America find meaning in its foreign policy outreach? Look at the oscillations, Republican and Democratic parties actually, ironically, taking different positions now. Democrats far more interventionist, Republicans now anti-intervention. Not seemingly responding to actual conditions overseas, but adjusting themselves to a different perception as to what the way circumstances today define this country and our meaning.
I guess I think we're in a period where the distance between foreign policy and domestic policy should be almost zero, in the sense that if you think that, we look around the world, we see a rising China, we see a resurgent Russia, we see the return of great power competition. Most of that competition is going to be economic. It may be somewhat ideological in terms of authoritarian systems versus democratic systems. There is, of course, a military component. But if that's the correct diagnosis, the number one thing we can do to have a strong ability to shape the world and protect our own economic prosperity and security is to invest in the drivers of American competitiveness at home. Research and development, science and technology, higher education, 21st century infrastructure, smart immigration policy that attracts and tries to keep the best talent from around the world. And so there's an incredible overlap and synergy between smart domestic policy that's good for the American people and our economy and exactly the kind of investment we need to make to be able to shape and deter and protect our interests overseas. And I think that's something we should capitalize on. But we need to, it's sort of a moonshot moment, and I don't see the leadership and the vision to really capitalize on that.
I'd like to bring it back to the American role in the world, which is something that to a large degree we choose. Currently, we are looking inward. The slogan, the catchphrase today is America First, which is a revival of a pre-war slogan, 1941, that mobilized America to avoid intervention in World War II. When we begin to concentrate on our problems, I don't know where shedding international obligations and an international perspective necessarily ends. America is safe. America is self-sufficient. Does America seek a role in the world for its own sake? Is there some aspect of America that requires us to claim a role in the world that will withstand, I would say, the current trend right now toward America First?
I don't know how in a globalized economy with international supply chains, the majority of American jobs dependent on trade and, how we pull back and not participate on a daily basis in setting the conditions for a more level and fair playing field for Americans. In a world of, where there's terrorism, where there are nuclear threats to us, where there's all kinds of other instability, I don't know how we assure Americans that they're safe at home if our posture is to wait until the threats come and strike us in America rather than dealing with some, at least managing some of them at distance. I don't know why we would give up the unique historical strategic advantage of the alliances we have. We can make them better burden sharing, we can make them more equal, we can make them more relevant and adapted to today. But boy, I bet China and Russia, they would love to have our alliance system. They don't have it. That's a huge instrument, a huge source of advantage for us to try to balance and constrain the negative actions of some of these rising powers.
So these are advantages. Bill, imperative. Is there an imperative along with an advantage?
I think it's very much in our interest. It's hard to prove that anything is an imperative, and I suppose we could and maybe we will experiment with a very different path than we've gone down for most of the last, I think 75 years, 70 years, I guess more like 74 now. 70 if it ended in 2015, 1945 to 2015. People talk about the Cold War and the post-Cold War era, and those were, of course, different in very major ways, but I think there's also been a lot of continuity in America's view of itself. That's why the indispensable nation was, Madeleine Albright said that post-Cold War, but it was true on things that were said during the Cold War. I guess I would just, so I have the sort of simple-minded view that, that worked out pretty well, has worked out pretty well compared to previous epochs of world history, like the preceding 50 years, for example. And I'm not willing to risk, or I'm very wary of so it's not an imperative, I guess, but just as a matter of actually what's better for us and for the world. And again, the oceans are great to have, but are they the same with air power and then with nuclear power and then with cyber and then with the kinds of threats? It doesn't mean that, I agree that one can go too far in the other direction and suddenly think one has to manage every problem everywhere, because any of them could eventually impinge on us. That would be over-arguing it. But I guess I would prefer to err on the side of a little more considerably more engagement and considerably more strength, both hard strength and soft power.
Mr. Kruger.
Yeah, I mean, the people who believe in strategic restraint aren't arguing that we disengage from the world. That's a red herring. The fact is that restrainers, realists, they want to maintain an engagement with the world. They largely want to do it economically, diplomatically. They just think that we should use military power more prudentially, that it should be focused more narrowly on our vital national interests of safety and the conditions of our prosperity, and that we aren't going overseas and trying to manage the world in a way that ultimately isn't in our interests. And that's been the problem, is that we've gotten over our skis and we've been tumbling down that mountain. And I think that the other part of that quote that Madeleine Albright has, where she talks about how we see further into the future, there's a kind of hubris there that we saw from that point forward in the post-Cold War world. And I think what restrainers want to do is to bring realism back into the conversation. There are real constraints in the world. Even a great power like ours, the best country in the world, right? We still face constraints. Barry talked earlier about nationalism. That's one that makes it very difficult. But it also could be an advantage of ours, because it means that other states have a harder time engaging easily in conquest and threatening the balance of power. Defensive technologies. So, anti-access area denial technologies can be used by our partners in a way that allows us not to have to be at the forefront. And we should take advantage of this. I mean, buck passing in international politics is underrated. We did this actually at the beginning of World War II, and it meant that the United States was in a favorable position when we did get in, and we were able to dominate the post-Cold War world because we hadn't lost tens of millions of people like others had, right? So this is a case in which the United States could actually profit, not in the economic sense, but in the strategic sense, from being more careful in how it harnesses its power and uses it, but still should maintain a strong national defense second to none.
Dr. Posen.
Well, in a very general sense, I think we're interested in great power peace, we're interested in economic and social exchange, and we're interested in cooperation to deal with collective bads such as climate change and other such things. The question is sort of how do we get there? And as I see the world, trying to do those things in a world where there's 2 or 3 or 4 other great powers is going to be different from trying to do those things in a world where there's one. And I think, and it's a controversial position, that the United States has really tried to establish a hegemonic position in the world and other regions, including Europe. And this makes it hard to cooperate with other great powers. So my own view is that we need to do a little bit less of telling other people how it's going to be and defining the security of ourselves and our allies in ways that are at disadvantage other great powers, and try and find some in between, some meeting of the minds. And this was the way great power politics was practiced in the late 19th century. It worked pretty well. It was consistent with the second great globalization. It would be somewhat less militarized for us, and it requires some more responsibility from others. But I think American statesmen could do this if they wanted to, and I think that's where they should go.
Well, we are having a very fruitful, stimulating, historic conversation in this country about America's role in the world, and I appreciate your contributions to it today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a debate as old as our country. One side sees American power as a shield against the need to expend great blood and treasure in the historically messy and ugly affairs of the rest of the world, believing that in so doing, for any reason beyond our own clear and vital interests, we risk losing that which is most special about American civilization. The other side believes it is quite simply an obligation, both morally and in terms of keeping America safe in a jungle-like world, for the United States to be the guarantor of peace, open commerce, and democracy everywhere. Added to this traditional split are the views of internationalists who stress multilateral, even global, problems and the need for cooperative solutions. The election of Donald Trump shocked the American national security establishment, both its liberal and conservative wings, and reopened the debate about America's role in the world. Of course, we leave it to you to draw your own now more informed conclusions. For The Whole Truth, I'm David Eisenhower. Thanks once again for watching.